The Epstein Transparency Act was just signed, and now the government's hands are tied and they have to release the files. But before you read the files on December 19th, there's new information that you need to know.
Epstein survivors released a statement just 2 days after the Epstein Transparency Act was signed. But before we get into the threats these survivors are now facing and hear directly from one of the survivors themselves, let's look at their first point in the statement because it's why Epstein's operation worked so well. So this statement came out just 2 days after the law was signed into place, and this is saying that this is what they are bracing for now that the government is going to be releasing these files. And the first one, so they're bracing for attempts to blame the victims for our own or each other's abuse. Years ago, Epstein got away with abusing us by portraying us as flawed and bad girls. We cannot let his enablers use this tactic to escape accountability now. Some of us were neglected children. Some of us were used to recruit other girls our age. These were tactics that Epstein and Maxwell used as they ensnared victims, and they are standard tactics of all sex traffickers. These tactics reflect on them, not on us. There's so much here.
Dang, guys, this is like textbook sex trafficking. We've been educating on this with students and the safe adults in their lives for the last 15 years. And this is one of the basic MOs that we would call friend recruitment of how pimps and traffickers recruit young people into sex trafficking. Yeah,
we usually talk about how there's 3 main recruitment methods the traffickers will use. It's posing as a boyfriend or girlfriend. A lot of people know this as like the lover boy method. There is a CEO pimp or business professional promising.
Which Jeffrey Epstein was posing as in some capacity.
Yeah, promising some sort of job offer or like money opportunity. And then there's also friend recruitment. And this is where traffickers will actually use current victims to recruit other people their same age and similar demographic, which makes sense on like why that's effective. Because especially for like a young girl, if we're talking about like these survivors being women, like they're not going to really trust like a middle-aged dude just kind of coming up to them.
Creeping up on them.
Like you're kind of a creeper. But someone their own age that's like, oh, this is great. You should meet this guy. There's these opportunities. Like that is something that they're going to be like way more likely to trust and kind of go along with. We heard from one survivor friend who she didn't know about trafficking at the time, and she was in junior high, and her friend was like, hey, let's go to this party. Because she didn't know about trafficking, she didn't realize that her friend had all these warning signs of sex trafficking that were going on. And it ended up that the party was all just a setup to recruit her into sex trafficking, and her friend was made to do it. And when we talk about this with students, oftentimes they're like, oh my gosh, like you think you can trust your friends, but you can't. Like you can't have friends anymore.
I can't have friends anymore.
Like this is crazy. And that's not necessarily the point of educating like that. It's more so like, hey, we need to know the warning signs, because when these victims are being threatened, they're being blackmailed, they're being forced to do things that they want to do. And even like this says that Epstein portrayed them as bad, like all of that psychological warfare like goes into people doing things that they normally wouldn't, which we'll get into a little bit later too, of like those threats and that violence that they face and causing them to do things that they normally wouldn't. But I do think that them being portrayed as bad and flawed is very relevant to what actually is happening online right now. Like I'm seeing people try to discredit these survivors and say that they're just in it for the money and like they're liars and like all this crazy stuff. And so we have actually colleagues who've worked with Epstein survivors, and yet it's crazy to see that parts of the internet are actually demonizing them and calling them liars.
Yeah, and we actually talked with Danny Pinner, who's a powerhouse lawyer who specializes in these kinds of cases, and she's currently representing one of Andrew Tate's victims and works along one of Epstein survivors. And so she's going to break down for us and explain this myth about the perfect victim, and one of the biggest reasons why in America we're missing it when it comes to sex trafficking cases. Let's check it out.
What do we need to do to get America to better address sex trafficking or be better educated on sex trafficking? It's the myth of the perfect victim. Traffickers always prey on a vulnerability. If it's a child, the vulnerability could just be that they're a child. They're too young to compete with. They could be easily manipulated. Most likely, a child also has other vulnerabilities. By and large, trafficking victims have a history of previous sexual abuse, which is exactly what makes them vulnerable targets to the trafficker. The traffickers suss this out, find this out, and they know that, oh, this person is going to be vulnerable. And that's why they choose them. And that's what we saw with Epstein. You know, there was this huge pattern. Almost all of these girls were coming out of the foster care. They had been in the foster care system or juvenile justice system. They were all troubled teens. Like that's who he was targeting and who Ghislaine was targeting intentionally. The trauma is so severe. One of the biggest things that happens is the person goes into like a self-destructive mode. So it's almost like if this victim was like perfectly happy and healthy, I almost feel like that of course they would use it against them too. They'd be like, you're not traumatized, you're fine. But like,
right.
you know,
They'd spin it.
and they would. And they'd spin it. But like, you know, it's almost proof of the trafficking that they have all these problems. I mean, you are going to expect to see serious trauma, which often it's like hurting yourself again. It's getting in bad relationships again. Sometimes it's being trafficked again because, you know, literally their brains are trying to fix a broken loop now. They're like, something very bad happened. How can I fix this? Often that's like, they're going back to similar patterns and they're trying to like get a different result. I mean, they don't even know they're doing that, but that's a very common trauma response.
Danny's commentary here is so powerful because she really breaks it down. She talks about the vulnerabilities that people experience, the traffickers are literally targeting for. And it doesn't necessarily mean that if you have those experiences in your past that you will be trafficked or like someone will come after you. Like, it's not saying that, but it's saying
those are a bigger target for traffickers and pimps. They specifically look for people that have those vulnerabilities. And Brianna,
they're manipulating them.
Right. And Brianna, you were even a peer mentor in an aftercare facility. What was that like, working with girls that were coming out of the life from ages 11 to 17?
Yeah, 11 to like 17. That was interesting because I think when like that was over 15 years ago, and the anti-trafficking movement was just getting started like here in Phoenix, and there are a lot of like even churches getting involved. They're like, oh my gosh, we're gonna like save these girls. They're gonna be like so grateful. They're gonna go through like this big healing process. And although I do think that there are like survivors are so grateful for whatever like aid and helped for like recovery and that healing process. But it was interesting when I went in, like the first night I went there, and there were like two girls, one was 17, one was 16, and the 17-year-old, she like got so pissed off while we were playing like a board game. She like got up, she like threw stuff across the room, she ran outside, she was screaming at the top of her lungs. Like, I was like, oh, like this is interesting. It was almost like she was throwing a tantrum like a 2-year-old would, but she had experienced so much trauma, especially for so long, and at the age of like an infant is when her trauma started. And so she was regressing back to that. And so I think oftentimes we think that they're just docile and they're so timid and all these things, and that wasn't my experience, which is fine. And not all like victim survivors like behave in those ways either. That's not to like paint like a general like stereotype like on anything, but it's just to say that oftentimes we think that people that have experienced trauma should look and act a certain way, and abuse is abnormal. It's kind of bizarre. And so when people act in ways that we don't understand in response to trauma, like it actually makes sense. If that, you know,
it's like, what would you expect when you've been through something? I mean, that's the conversation with soldiers and warriors that come back from war and are experiencing things that don't make sense and add up in civilian life because they've been through things that don't make sense.
Yeah. And it's not to put like, I don't know, like the specifics of like Epstein survivors, like all of those things that like, I know some that people are discrediting because of XYZ in their past and their partners and things that they've said or done. And I don't know. I feel like it's one of those things where it's like, even if they lied about certain things, even if it has nothing to do with Epstein and like the case, like it doesn't negate or like invalidate the experience that they did have with Epstein. Even if like some things that they're being accused of are true, it doesn't negate that experience or the trauma of Epstein, if that makes sense. And so what it really comes down to is, where's the evidence? Did this actually happen? And if it did, they deserve justice. And
for sure. Yeah. And that's where I think what's crazy in the context of all of this is now that what these survivors feared most in point number 2, which we're going to pull up, this is actually happening. And so it says, incomplete disclosures. Other than redacting victim names, we want all the files disclosed. We ask that our champions in Congress and in the public continue fighting to make sure all materials are released and not just selected ones. And that's been a huge controversy. Everyone's like, are we actually going to get the files? Are they going to redact all of these things? And there's so many reasons for why redactions need to get made. And so I appreciate these survivors saying like, no, other than our names, everything needs to be released. And unfortunately, like they're saying this, and unfortunately, their names are actually being released. This is crazy. This article was actually posted. A law firm representing alleged Epstein victims sends scathing letter over DOJ document release. It says, when the House Oversight Committee released a trove of files and emails from the Epstein estate earlier this month, alleged victims of the convicted sex offender responded with widespread panic after learning the documents included dozens of unredacted victim names. Dang, y'all. Literally, they had one ask.
For real.
Just one.
They couldn't do it. It says, I thought the government had promised to redact our names and identifying material. I don't understand how this is happening again when alleged victim told attorneys. This type of negligence by the government to a survivor is just unable to comprehend. It's just impossible. Like, that is horrible. This is the justice system, right? Like, the justice system exists for victims and survivors of crimes against them. Yeah. And this is one of the most basic ways that they can actually have justice, like, be honored in it. Like, it also continues to say, and I think this is like a really good point. These women are not political pawns. They're mothers, wives, and daughters. These are women who were abused by Jeffrey Epstein and in some instances by others, and who have already had their rights violated in the past by the government. They're human beings who have the right to be treated with dignity and respect and feel safe and protected by our country, which has failed them time and time again, and especially our justice system, because that's the point of the justice system, to be able to be treated with dignity and respect and protected and feel safe after like having violations and crimes against you. That's just kind of like basic stuff. But this actually, it makes sense that they would want their names redacted because they're already facing one of their biggest fears. And this is in point 3, what they make in their statement. It says, threats to our physical safety. So their names have been leaked. Some that didn't want their names like to be public, and now they're having threats to their physical safety. Many of us have already received death threats and other threats of harm. We are bracing for these to escalate. We ask every federal and state law enforcement agency that has jurisdiction over these threats to investigate them and protect us. Guys, we wonder why like victims stay anonymous. Why don't they just run away or name names? It's because of the threats, and they're actually happening. This isn't them just being like afraid. It's not just, oh, like that could happen, but it's not. So you just have to have bravery and do the right thing. Like, no, they're actually facing threats, and now their names have been released.
Yeah.
Against their will.
And this reminds me of, there was one survivor that we know who was being trafficked and told her trafficker, like, hey, I'm not going to do this anymore. Like, I don't care what you do to me. Like, I'm leaving. And he was like, okay, that's fine. You can leave. But if you leave, I'm going to find your sister and pour battery acid all over her face. Oh, and by the way, she lives at this address, gets on the bus at this time, and goes to this school. And if you don't believe me, here's a picture of someone that I've done it to. There's a different level of threat in these situations when it's beyond just their own physical safety. Yeah. And like, it's extending way beyond that. And because, again, the way traffickers and pimps work is they embed themselves in their victims' lives, finding out all the details before the victim or survivor knows what's even going on at that point.
Absolutely. And so then for them to know that they're going to be facing, then that wasn't an Epstein case, that's different, but like they were being, I'm assuming, blackmailed and threatened, like physical safety being threatened, like they didn't know how to get out of those situations when they were in it. And then to now be out of it and still be facing threats and still being misunderstood, and they're not even being exploited anymore. Like, that's a really unfortunate situation. And so I think it's fine to ask questions. I think it's fine to be wondering why, like, well, when you're in those situations, why don't you just leave? And when you're out of the situation, why don't you just name names? Like, I think for us to have genuine curiosity around that, I think that's normal.
We hear that from students when we're in the classroom. They're like, hey, and they're like, why doesn't she just run away or call the cops? Or why doesn't she just go get a job at McDonald's instead? It's like, okay.
And there's, I think, genuine curiosity. You can ask those questions out of judgment. You can also ask those questions out of genuine curiosity.
For sure. And which it is a lot of times. And I'm glad that a lot of people asking that question don't have the context to understand why.
Exactly. But I do think that it's important to understand why and actually believe that that is why, so that we can truly have justice in these situations and work with those that have experienced these dynamics so that they actually do get justice for themselves. But before we hear directly from an Epstein survivor, this all gets crazier when we see people actually trying to turn these survivors against each other. And this is the 4th point in the statement that they released. They said they're bracing for efforts to pull us apart. We are already hearing efforts to suggest that victims who had reached the age of 18 were not really victims anymore. That's insane. People are saying that. We denounce this outrageous statement. Some of us were over 18 when we were victimized. Some of us were vulnerable because of childhood sexual abuse. Some were vulnerable because of poverty. Some were assaulted by Epstein and Maxwell and their accomplices using force, intimidation, and violence. All of us were vulnerable because of life circumstances our young selves faced that were manipulated by Epstein and Maxwell and for which we were targeted, which is exactly what Danny was talking about. A 22-year-old is no match for a forceful and determined pair of hardened, methodical, middle-aged predators. That's so true. We reject any claim that once a girl turned 18, she was fair game. Epstein and Maxwell used predator tactics against us. Their methods varied from girl to girl and young woman to young woman, but the common thread is the devastation their abuse left behind in each of us. Those girls and young women are fully adult women now, and we stand together resolutely against any attempt to divide us. Man, that's amazing. Like, those survivors are phenomenal for releasing that. And before we get into our thoughts, we actually want you to hear from Epstein survivor Jess Michaels and her scathing rebuke of those saying that she wasn't a victim of Epstein because she was over 18.
I was raped by Jeffrey Epstein at 22 years old. People often call him a child rapist, and while that is true, he also raped adult women in their 20s, women like me. When we only focus on the children, we erase the lives of adults that were shattered too. Rape doesn't suddenly hurt less because you're technically old enough. The trauma is real regardless of age, and the damage is long-lasting. Every survivor, child or adult, deserves to be heard, seen, supported, and believed.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, guys, it's so gross to think that there's a mindset of like, oh, yeah, just because they were 20, 22 years old, they're fair game now.
That's just...
Like, that's not a normal thought.
No, and I think it's like what we're doing in this conversation is we're focusing on the behavior of the predators, the behaviors of the people that actually hurt others. And your age doesn't change how like abuse affects you. Like, abuse is abuse. It's going to have the same, like, our brains work the same way, like whether we are 3 years old or we're 30 years old. Like, our brains are going to respond to things very similarly no matter our age. And so this is insane too, because even the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, literally the law that was passed in 2000 defining sex trafficking, says that you can be an adult and experience trafficking as well. Like, it says, to Danny's point even, that if you are a child, then you're automatically considered a victim if there is any type of commercial sex happening that you are experiencing. And it says many of these persons are trafficked into the international sex trade, often by force, fraud, or coercion. So if someone is an adult that is being sex trafficked, they have to prove force, fraud, or coercion, because adults legally do have levels of consent that children do not. But it says traffickers primarily target women and girls. So both. Like, it's not just minors, it's adults as well. And then this is really crazy too. It says traffickers often make representations to their victims that physical harm may occur to them or others should the victim escape or attempt to escape, which goes completely back into everything that we were saying earlier. Such representations can have the same coercive effects on victims as direct threats to inflict such harm. And that applies to the adults. It also applies to the kids. And so legally we can see that adults can be victims too. And so I think it's kind of weird because I'm not sure that before the Epstein situation, people would necessarily say that adults can't be sexually abused. You know, like, I feel like there's certain things that are happening with this case that like make people defensive about concepts and things that like I think we like pretty much agreed on as a society. I'm not exactly sure what that is or where that's coming from, but it seems to be there in one way or another.
Yeah. And I think the point of all of this is that if we don't understand sex trafficking, injustice is going to happen because we're expecting it to look one way when it looks totally different. And so if you want to know what sex trafficking looks like today and how it works, sign up for our free Red Flags program. Brand new, just came out. It's for parents and the safe adults in kids' lives who want to keep their kids safe from exploitation. And it's packed full of resources, y'all.
And so if you want to learn more about why the Epstein case has happened the way it is, the friend recruitment and the grooming process and the threats, but ultimately, if you want to learn how to keep your kids safe from exploitation, then definitely sign up for this. It's a completely free program. And I think oftentimes what we can think about, or what these Epstein cases, these high level, high profile people, like these kinds of trafficking cases, I think the impression that it can give us is that it's only the elite of society that are trafficking, and therefore it's only a select few that are actually being exploited. Unfortunately, most pimps and traffickers, they're just everyday people like you and I. Most pimps and traffickers that are targeting kids and exploiting them are not like Epstein. They're not these high profile people. And so it's really important to understand how trafficking actually happens so we can keep our kids truly safe.